Hello everyone and welcome to this latest edition of the Edinburgh Fortean Society online. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gordon Rutter and I organise these events. Normally we would meet on the second Tuesday of every month in a local pub at 7:30, and we're keeping those timings live for these particular online events. Tonight we've got a long-term member of the Edinburgh Fortean Society talking on one of his favourite subjects, and also talking in August. Normally during August we don't have a talk because of the Edinburgh Fringe, but we're taking advantage of the current situation to allow us to have talks at this time of year. So ladies and gentlemen, talking on Planet of the Mystery Apes, we have Scott Lyall. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Scott Lyall, and today I'm going to be talking on Planet of the Mystery Apes, which is a global look at unknown primates. So, reports on mystery primates become part of popular culture in English-speaking countries like America, Canada, the UK, through the 20th century. Kind of kicked off around the 1920s. There was interest in the Yeti as a result of various expeditions in the Himalayas, Mount Everest, and so on. When Western climbers brought back stories of the Yeti, around a similar kind of time in the 1920s in British Columbia, you had J.W. Burns, who was an Indian agent in the First Nations reservations in British Columbia, collected stories of the First Nations encounters with a race of hairy giants. There's various names for them, but he coined the term Sasquatch based on similar sounding First Nations terms for them. So this is when they first started kind of bleeding through into Western popular culture. And then you in the 1950s in Northern California, Bluff Creek, the term Bigfoot was coined, following a discovery of large footprints, a number of encounters with large hairy creatures in the Bluff Creek area of Northern California. Following that, you then had the Patterson Gimlin film, which is shot in 1967. So whether it's real or fake, and that's still very much up for debate. It kind of popularised the idea of large hairy creatures in the Pacific Northwest, and it kind of reified the idea of what these looked like. And then off the back of that, you then had various sort of popular documentaries, such as In Search Of and so on. And also in the early 70s, the Legend of Boggy Creek, which was a drama, a fictionalised film, but based on real encounters with a Bigfoot type creature in the swamps of Arkansas. So by this point, Bigfoot and Yeti were becoming sort of popular culture staples. There's various films. They appeared in things like Doctor Who. There was a Peter Cushing film in the 50s featuring the abominable snowman and so on. But these creatures have actually been reported from all around the world. It's not just the Yeti and Bigfoot, so that's what I'm going to be looking at here. So we'll kick off with a quick look at Bigfoot itself. It's probably the most well-known of these creatures, mainly because it occurs in English-speaking countries of like the USA, Canada, so it's easy for these for reports of these to kind of make it out. And previously, they would maybe make local press, like local newspapers and so on, would report a sightings, which are typically maybe somebody's out driving, a large creature will run across the road, or they may encounter them when they're hunting or something like that. And since the death of local press, it's still easy to report these creatures through this massive amount of websites, podcasts, and so on. So if somebody has a Bigfoot encounter, it's much easier for them to put that into the public domain. And there's some databases, like the Bigfoot Research Organisation and so on, has a database of sort of thousands of sightings. So we talk about Bigfoot. These are large, hairy creatures reported from the North America, particularly the Pacific Northwest, although they are reported from across the country, particularly the southeast, and that shows up some very interesting reports and research comes from sort of east of Texas, Oklahoma. These areas are actually quite densely wooded, which may be for people out with the area, but maybe not so well known. So they're usually described as being tall, around about 7-8 feet tall. They're bulky, powerfully built. Their hair's usually black, brown or red, but white, grey, and blonde hair is also reported. So the same kind of spectrum of hair colours you would get in humans. The neck's described as being short and thick or completely absent altogether. Sometimes described as the head just sitting directly on the shoulders. Flat-faced, so there's no snout. The sagittal crest is usually reported. These are the things you often see, you may be familiar with from gorillas. It's like the pointed head, which is effectively additional muscles that anchor the jaw. That's in basically a feature of large primates who live in vegetation. So you'll see that in gorillas and sometimes orangutans. Usually reported as, majority of the time, being reported as being bipedal, sometimes quadrupedal, so as in walking on four legs, but majority of the times walking on two. They're often reported as being really smelly. Usually, sometimes described as having a sort of sulphurous or sort of rotten eggs kind of smell, but sometimes that would be a more sort of excrement-y kind of smell. And it leaves large footprints. Now, there's a degree of consistency in the footprints. There's large five-toed footprints, but there is a variation. Sometimes there's a number of three-toed footprints, sometimes four. So there's a bit of consistency, but not 100%. So moving on to the sort of South American cousin, who are Modelgrand. Now, there's various different mystery primates from South America. Just for brevity, I'm only going to really discuss the Modelgrand, but there's various other ones such as the Manapingiri and so on that are kind of similar, but the Modelgrand translates as big monkey. It's reported from Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Where it's reported from kind of dense sort of jungle kind of areas. So it's usually described as an upright gorilla-like creature with long arms. Sometimes reported to use clubs. So with Bigfoot, it's quite rare for them to reported be using any sort of technology or anything like that. But here, these creatures are reported as wielding clubs sometimes. And they're often been regarded as dangerous to human beings that will apparently attack people who get too close. Now, this is a feature of South American reports, and that there seems to be a lot more aggression to them than there is from their sort of North American cousins. So, hopping across the Pacific, we have Hibigan, who's reported from the Mount Hiba region of Japan. Now, it's reported to be around about 5 foot tall and being similar to a gorilla or a monkey. There's a spate of reports in the 1970s which kind of petered out in the 80s. There doesn't seem to be many sort of contemporary reports, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of reports before this time. Because many of these creatures, you can track sightings back in some instances hundreds of years. But with Hibigan, it seems to be a fairly concentrated phenomenon in the sort of 70s and 80s. Now, as it's close to Hiroshima, that was obviously suffered a nuclear attack in the Second World War, some people have speculated that the creature was actually a mutant caused by radiation. Although others had speculated it was just simply an escaped pet, but it was maybe a chimp or something like that had escaped. It's worth noting that Japan's one of the few places that has non-human primates living in a temperate environment. Most apes and monkeys are confined to tropical areas, but Japan does have species of snow-dwelling monkeys. But this doesn't seem to be what's behind Hibigan. So jumping across the China Sea, we've got the Yeren in China. This photo here is a statue from a Chinese national park that shows a Yeren and its young. So the name translates as wild man, and that's a common thing with most of the names that are used in different countries for their Bigfoot type creatures often translate as wild man or hairy man or something like that. So it's reported from central or eastern China, places such as Hubei province, which these areas are sort of substantial wilderness areas. So it's usually reported as being about 6 to 8 foot tall with reddish hair, maybe a more human-like head, maybe less robust than the likes of Sasquatch. So there's documented reportings going back to the 17th centuries with the books written at the time that mentioned these wild people. There has been a number of state-sponsored expeditions with sort of 50s and 60s to look for the creature, but these have failed to turn up any sort of conclusive evidence. So jumping down to the Himalayas, we have the Yeti, which is, again, after Bigfoot's possibly the most famous mystery primate of them all. So yes, from Himalayas. It comes from the Sherpa phrase Yeti, which means that thing. But in actual fact, it's three different creatures. The first is the Meti, which is an upright ape-like creature with a conical head. It's usually red or black fur with long arms. So this is maybe the most kind of ape-like creature, maybe and possibly the closest to Bigfoot, or the sort of popular image of what the Yeti is. I just take a detour here to say Yeti is often portrayed as a large sort of white furred creature, and that's not actually what's reported from people in the Himalayas. The other one is the Zute. It's a creature that walks on four legs most of the time, sometimes occasionally two legs, and attacks livestock. That's possibly a bear. Bears are often used as an explanation for Bigfoot and similar type creatures. And it's often a go-to explanation for the Yeti. And I think for this type of Yeti, it possibly is the most obvious explanation. The third is the Temla, which is a small red furred creature, maybe 3-4 foot tall, with thick reddish hair, and these apparently exist in the lushly vegetated valleys of Nepal, where they live off frogs and other sort of small creatures. Moving north, we've got the Almasty. They reported through Central Asia, so basically Mongolia, Western China, through to the Caucasus Mountains on the sort of fringes of Europe. They're also known as Almas, Kaptar, Gul. It's various other kind of local names, but again, these all, as mentioned before, these all sort of roughly translate as wild person. So the first written report comes from the 1400s. It's a Bavarian nobleman named Hans Schlittberger, who was captured by a Mongolian prince and held at his court for a time. He wrote a book when he returned to Europe after his release, and he noticed that the wild people that were said to live in the Tian Shan Mountains, these are described as a people with nothing in common with other people. They were covered in a hairy pelt, all with their faces and hands being hairless. He claimed to have seen a couple of these people have been gifted to his captor by a local warlord. So there's so there's first report in the 1400s. Reports carry on to this day. There's a really interesting report from the 1940s that appeared in a popular Russian science magazine in the 1950s. So there was a lieutenant colonel in the Red Army named V.S. Karapetyan reported that being asked to examine a man who'd been caught by the sort of home guard in the sort of mountains of Dagestan. So this is during the height of the Second World War, where Russia's been invaded by Germany. So in the areas that aren't on the front line, there's still obviously a lot of tension, and the suspicion was that this person was a spy. So he was a medical doctor, and he'd been asked to examine this person who'd been caught, as to establish whether or not he was a wild person or a spy. So when he got to the buildings where this person was being, or creature was being kept, he found that they were being kept in a shed as they sweated too much when brought indoors. So it described the creature as being shaped like a man, around 180 centimetres tall, naked but covered in brown fur, which compared to a bear, with thin light hair on his face but no beard. He was bigger and stronger looking than the locals. His eyes were dull and empty looking like those of an animal. So he gave the opinion this was obviously some sort of wild person and not a spy, and then left and returned to his unit. So he never found out what happened to the person, although it was likely he was just put to a firing squad, because on the reasoning that the people of Dagestan have been living under the Soviet system for probably about maybe 20, 30 years at that point. And obviously that was raising their standard of living, therefore there couldn't be wild people, so he obviously would have been a spy. So it's likely it's unfortunate wild person met their demise at the front of a firing squad. So these ones are generally described as more human-like than other mystery primates. If you look at kind of books written about maybe the 70s or 80s, it's often put forward that these could be surviving Neanderthals, although there's there's no indication they use fire. Very few indications that they've got much in the way of culture or tool use, which be sort of key identifiers of Neanderthals. So that's possibly based on outdated understanding of what the Neanderthals are like. They are, however, sometimes reported as wearing scavenged or stolen clothes. There's accounts from villagers that live in these areas that they sometimes feel sorry for the creatures. The creatures sometimes approach settlements for food, and they would sometimes give them like old cloaks and so on to help them cope in the harsh environment. So they are occasionally reported as wearing clothes. Again, there's another state-sponsored expedition to look for the creatures in the 1950s, but they didn't find anything. And after that, the subject became sort of persona non grata in sort of Soviet circles. And then there are a number of Soviet scientists who carried on researching the creatures, but it didn't have any official backing. They had to do that in their own time, use their own resources. So, moving down to Southeast Asia, we have the Goi Rung. So this is reported from the jungles of Vietnam. And again, the name translates as forest people. They're described as around about 6 foot tall with reddish hair, strongly built with pot bellies. In the forests or jungles, they would be known to approach camps and sit by the fire, but they would sit down and but they wouldn't speak. If people would speak to them, they'd either not respond or they'd respond with unintelligible grunts. So they're reported by both sides during the Vietnam War. It was a North Vietnamese general so struck by these accounts from his troops, he actually sent an expedition to look for them in 1974, but in common with other state-sponsored expeditions, didn't find them. On the American side, these creatures were known as rock apes for their tendency to throw rocks at people during if they encountered in the jungle. There's various accounts of the creatures being caught in the middle of firefights between the Vietnamese and the Americans. There's various interesting accounts of American troops encountering them, and then going back to maybe in the 2000s, maybe going to Vietnam veteran forums, then discussing these apes that they'd encountered, and only then realising that these weren't a known species. So it's kind of interesting that there was accounts of them for people that didn't realise they were encountering a cryptid species. If you're familiar with the story of the Minnesota Iceman, which is a apparent Bigfoot type body that was circulating around sort of fairs and shows in America in the early 70s. One of the origin stories for it that had been shot in Vietnam. It's basically what's purported to be a dead body, but there's definitely it's probably a model, but there's some that believe that they haven't seen the model that circulated later on. There's some people that believed what they saw wasn't the model that was later exhibited. And one of the origins for this body was apparently one of the origin stories was apparently Vietnam. So still staying in Southeast Asia, we have the orang pendek. It's reported for the jungles of Sumatra. The name translates as short person. It's reported as being about 4 or 5 foot tall, brown with black hair, often longer on the head. And again, it's well attested by local tribespeople, but also colonists. There's a sort of famous report for a Portuguese settler in the early 1900s, as well as that Westerners who visited Sumatra. Like the conservationist Debbie Martyr have had encounters with the orang pendek. And of all these creatures, this is the one that's generally regarded to be the one most likely to exist. You've got, obviously, the lush jungle environment. You've already got known primates in the areas, like orangutans. The speculation it could maybe be a ground-dwelling form of orangutan. We've also, there's been various expeditions looking for it, like friend of the Edinburgh Fortean Society, Richard Freeman's been on a number of expeditions, and these turned up interesting evidence such as hair, footprints and so on, a number of sightings, but it's maybe just stopped short of the sort of knockout blow, say, coming back, incontrovertible proof like, say, a body or something like that. But overall, it's the one that's possibly most likely to exist. stayed in Southeast Asia, we've got the orang dalam, which is reported from the jungles of Johor, Malaysia. And the name translates as man of the interior. Now, in contrast to the orang pendek, these are described as 10 to 12 foot tall, which is bigger than the majority of these kind of creatures here. This picture here is a reconstruction of an encounter with the orang dalam in the jungles of Malaysia. It was investigated by Bernard Heuvelmans, who's regarded as the father of cryptozoology, and this is what he was studying the kind of last days of his life before he kind of passed away. So kind of different to the majority of the other mystery primates reports just by sheer size. Now, there is a sort of subtype or subspecies of mystery primate that seem to be significantly bigger than most of the others. The speculation these are maybe based on descended from Gigantopithecus, which is a giant fossil ape, although we don't know the size of this creature because we only know it from teeth and jaw bones. And we can't actually work out its height from the fossils that are available. So some are described as human-like, but the vast majority are frequently compared to apes, sometimes like a giant gorilla or orangutan. So they're said to live with fruit and fish, especially durian, which is a foul-smelling fruit, kind of smell partly quite a lot like excrement. And they leave four-toed prints, which is unusual for a primate because all known primates have 5 toes. So moving to Australia, we have the Yowie. If you are interested in the Yowie, I highly recommend this book by Tony Healy and Paul Cropper. It's a really definitive study. I can't recommend this book enough. But so reported from Australia, mainly eastern regions like the Blue Mountains and Gold Coast. The name's probably a neologism, but some accounts will tell you it's an Aboriginal word. There's some debate around that. They do have some similar sounding words, but most Aboriginal cultures will have a term that will translate roughly as hairy man. So it's known from Aboriginal times. Some Aboriginal cultures will say that the hairy man was there when their descendants first arrived in Australia and had to battle them. There's others that will. It's known to basically most Aboriginal cultures. And then when the first kind of European colonists started arriving, they started having experiences with them. They seem to tail off in the sort of early 20th century for some reason, and that might have been due to sort of demographic reasons where the Aboriginals were sort of separated from their own culture, and then there was a shift away from the sort of white Europeans living on the land, but then they started to pick up again in the sort of 60s or 70s as people spent more time in the countryside and cities also started to sprawl out. So it's worth noting that some of these cities or settlements, you can actually, in some parts of Australia, you can go through fairly built up areas that'll kind of butt into like very kind of dense wilderness or thick jungle quite quickly. So basically known for Aboriginal times through to modern times. If you're familiar with the book Rabbit Proof Fence, which was filmed maybe about 10-15 years ago, about the story of a number of young Aboriginal girls who wanted to escape from a colonial school to return to their families. There's a Yowie encounter in that. It didn't actually make it into the film, unfortunately. So one thing that's striking about the when you read like back-to-back reports of the Yowie, you see that there's two strong descriptors that come in consistently. One is it looks like an upright gorilla, or the other, when you start reading accounts for the late 70s, it will compare them to Chewbacca. So the phenomenon is basically identical to Bigfoot in terms of how it operates. The creatures are very similar sounding. You do get accounts of Bigfoot that sound a lot like Chewbacca, that they have hairy faces, like their completely hair-covered faces, with just would be the eyes visible. But it's very rare to find that as a descriptor or comparison. But otherwise it's very similar. And often engaged in similar behaviours to Bigfoot, such as stone throwing, or sort of behaviours that are attributed to Bigfoot rather. But it's a very identical phenomenon. But one thing that's worth noting is that Australia's obviously been isolated from other countries for in terms of evolutionary terms for millions of years. So the placental mammals never made it there. All indigenous mammals are marsupial. So how a primate could have made it there, or a non-human primate could have made it there, is very problematic to explain. So that's something we'll maybe need to come back to consider. So moving to Africa, we have the creatures called X. Now, Jacqueline Erbard was a Swiss South American anthropologist who lived with the Maasai people in Kenya. One day, she had a copy of Time magazine that had a reconstruction of Homo habilis, the early human species on it, and one of the tribespeople spotted that and claimed that that he knew where sort of similar creatures stayed locally. So she began collecting reports for Kenya and surrounding regions of similar creatures. She identified 5 different types she labelled X1 to 5, X1 being a Bigfoot type creature, X2 being a sort of small kind of hairy hominid. But perhaps the most interesting one, the creature she labelled X5. These are ones that actually use tools and bows and arrows, and a bow and arrow is actually recovered from the encounter we won. So these creatures were described as being sort of, roughly 1.5 meters tall. They're sort of robustly built, kind of dark complexion with long white hair on the head, and they're quite wary of humans. So there's an encounter. There's an encounter with one some tribespeople had, and it's rushed to escape. The creature, well, I say creature, but it's possibly very likely to be human or very close to human. Left its bow and arrows. So its bow is actually stringed with elephant tendon, whereas most of the local tribespeople would use antelope tendon, and it's a style of construction completely different to what local tribespeople would use. So this is our here along with the bow and arrow. Apparently, it was examined by the British Museum, who couldn't match it to any known style of bows for their collection. So I'm not sure where this has ended up. But unfortunately, most of our work is in French and hasn't been translated into English. So if we've got any Francophone listeners who would be up for translating our books into English, I would maybe encourage you to do that for us all. But she was actually like a well-known anthropologist. When she died, she got obituaries and things like the New York Times and stuff. So it's a similar publication. So she's not like a fringe figure. She's a sort of fairly sort of heavyweight anthropologist. But this work was generally sort of disregarded, sort of put aside. But it's quite interesting. There are various other reports of creatures from Africa. I put this one just because it's the more interesting. A lot of the other ones are reports from basically colonial times. So I would be again. I think it's probably a language barrier. We don't necessarily get that many sort of first-hand reports from Africans themselves, but or there's not much in the cryptozoology literature. So again, that's possibly an area with somebody who's who could translate that would be probably a great interest. So, finally, the most sort of problematic one is there are reports from places like Britain. I think do get them in Western Europe, also parts of places like places in North America and so on, where that aren't wilderness areas. So, they do get reports from areas where creatures just couldn't exist. So they're not that well attested in folklore. I mean, there's things like brownies, urisks, and so on, wood roses, but it's not that are kind of hairy creatures that exist in wild places. But these aren't there's not a sort of consistent line in the same way you say the Yowie would have. There's sort of sporadic reports or records. For instance, the late 19th century, you've got the band Monkey or Ranton, which was encountered on the Shropshire Canal. Somebody late at night, a guy travelling along by the canal, and this sort of chimpanzee-like creature jumped on the back of his horse and he struck it with his whip, but his whip went right through. So it's obviously some sort of phantom or supernatural type creature. But since the sort of early 2000s, there's been a sort of growing body of reports or encounters with Bigfoot type creatures in the UK. So there's a high degree of hoax in here. There's obviously people having a laugh. There's a book on Cannock Chase, for instance, that includes a number of sort of Bigfoot type sightings, as well as various other supernatural reports. It is like completely hoaxed. It's not like people, if they do want to have a laugh, is something that they might do. But there does seem to be a sort of small number of reports that, if they occurred in, say, like the Pacific Northwest, would be sort of accepted without question. And maybe does this maybe tell us a little bit phenomena itself? So, high number. There's a small number of interesting reports. Taking one local to us, in sort of 2005, there was a guy who was driving home from Dundee, encountered a sort of 7-foot ape-like creature which ran out of the road in front of him around about the Five Rose roundabout in Fife, which disappeared into the woods. He stopped the car and he could hear it sort of crashing through the woods, but he couldn't follow it. It didn't have a torch, so he couldn't follow it. And there are a number of sort of similar reports from around the country. So, can these creatures exist? So, descriptions aren't actually that far removed from known primates. So, unlike, say, reports of surviving dinosaurs where they'd have to come down millions of years unchanged in an environment that'd be very different to what they were used to living in, they're or say like Mothman, where you've got two different types of two genesis of creatures kind of merged together. They're not really evolutionary that controversial, because again, you will see people saying, "Oh, scientists aren't interested. It would upset or understand evolution." It probably wouldn't. The chances are, if a Bigfoot steps out in front of a logging truck tomorrow, they'll probably find that on analysis that's maybe not that far removed from known primates, whether that's humans, orangutans, gorillas, or chimps. So, there's no reason that that they couldn't exist. So in the past, they were often thought to be evolutionarily unfeasible, because they were quite often there was a more linear view of evolution, and that would go from lemurs to monkeys to apes to early humans to modern humans. So if someone displayed like ape characteristics, like say the sagittal crest, but walking upright, that would be a problem. But in actual fact, the sort of primate lineage is probably more diverse, maybe more like a bush than a tree. So it's impossible that things, say, like walking upright, may have evolved more than once. So there's no real reason that these creatures couldn't exist. There's been around 40 new primates have been discovered in the 21st century. However, these have all been monkeys or lemurs. There was an instance maybe about 10, 15 years ago, there was a new ape was allegedly discovered, the billy ape, who were described as being a cross between chimps and gorillas, and they'd been kind of large and aggressive, and they would kill lions and so on. But when these were actually finally discovered, they were just basically large and aggressive. It's a large and aggressive population of the common chimp. So basically, these are genetically similar, identical to other chimps. So there was a recent study estimating rates of discovery of new species, highlighted that Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia and Colombia being countries most likely to be harbouring undiscovered species. So that's good news for the orang pendek. However, we'd put a big caveat on that the majority of these species are likely to be small animals such as amphibians. The study did also point out that small creatures with a limited range are the ones most likely to remain undiscovered, whereas larger creatures with bigger ranges were much more likely to have been discovered. So many of the regions that these reports come from could support a population of such creatures. So the Pacific Northwest, for instance, you've got temperate rainforest, you've got massive areas with just very, very few people in them. You've got the various sort of jungles in Australia, jungles of Malaysia and Indonesia for the orang pendek, parts of Africa. These are all places that could support a creature. Some areas patently can't. Like for instance, Britain. We were heavily deforested by I think by the early 20th century, we were down to maybe 2% forest cover. that has recovered, but most of what's there now is plantation forest. It's not a good environment for wild creatures. So yeah. So the key question here, it's not could they exist, because they obviously can, but the key question is, could they exist without leaving evidence? So do they exist then? We'll have a look at what evidence there is. Well, no body's been put in front of a zoologist to allow formal classification. So the way new species are classified is that a sample a sample body would be put in front of someone who would formally describe it. And then from there, all other specimens can be matched to sort of be formally classified. There's no a type specimen. So we've never, none of these creatures have ever been formally classified. There's various stories about dead creatures turning up, but something always happens to the body that prevents it being handed over for formal classification. So it'll be along the lines of it'll be shot, and the body will maybe fall into like a crevice or something, or fall into a river and be lost, or the person thinks they've committed a crime, then they bury it, or that the body's recovered by other creatures, or is somehow been made inaccessible. There's a lot of instances where people have had guns that have encountered these creatures, have lined up a shot, then felt it's too close to human, and that they would be committing murders if they shot it. So you do not everyone who encounters it whose arm feels that they should be shooting it. There's also various accounts of people finding remains, like there's an instance in, I think it was Northern California, where somebody found a strange skull in a stream. So they handed that to sent that to a university, who then apparently lost it. So there's various accounts of remains being handed over, but then this goes astray. So, but again, it's difficult to know what kind of weight to put on them. But certainly, as I speak today, nothing's been ever formally classified. There's no unambiguous films or photographs in the public domain. Most films and photographs that are out there are very blurry, difficult to make anything out of, and the ones that are clear are very controversial as well. So going back to the Patterson-Gimlin film, it was shot in 1967, but even today it's still a contentious subject as to whether or not it's real or faked. No equivalent footage has ever been shot. But then likewise, if it's a fake, nobody's ever been able to make a fake the same quality. If it's real, nobody's ever filmed more creatures. If it's a fake, nobody's ever produced a suit. There's at least 3 people who claim to be the person in the suit. There's no outtakes. Dependent on various competing analysis of it. So some people say that the way the creature moves, a human couldn't. Others people say it's well within human possibilities, and some of that depends on the speed the film shot at, which is unfortunately not known. So it's various other photographs, some are more or less interesting than others, but majority don't really, none of them really prove anything. And again, you do hear accounts of people having really great sort of film or video evidence, but they don't put it in the public domain for whatever reason. Partly maybe to avoid, they don't want the hassle of it, they don't want people coming on their land, they want to protect the creatures, so these have to basically just remain stories. So with various footprints, like plaster casts or footprints, these are intriguing. Some will show interest in forensic detail, like toes that have moved, the foot's flexed, and so on. So there's interesting forensic detail in some of these, because we have the cliched image of like a guy with fake wooden feet, so strapped to his shoes, walking through the forest. But that would actually act like snowshoes, and would spread your weight out, so make it harder to sink in. But again, without a type specimen, this footprint evidence is interesting, but doesn't really conclusively prove the creatures are real. DNA studies are things that are going to become more important. particularly the environmental DNA. So people be familiar with, possibly familiar with Brian Sykes' study, the late Brian Sykes' study of various hair samples, genetic samples that apparently came from a range of mystery primates around the world a few years ago. Genetic analysis of this showed that none of this was proved to come from an unknown primate. Majority seem to come from known species such as bears, wolves, dogs, and so on. Environmental DNA is something that's going to possibly come more use in cryptozoology as it becomes more accessible in terms of price and so on. It was famously used in Loch Ness a few years ago, where basically they take a sample of water or earth, and then basically as creatures move about, they shed DNA into the environment through like sweat and hair and skin cells and so on. So that can tell you, this technology can tell you what creatures have been in an area. So this has been used in Bigfoot research a number of times recently. There was an instance of a suspected Bigfoot nest in Oregon. Olympic Peninsula rather, in Washington State. So it's Podcast Wild Thing paid for environmental DNA to be done on this, and it was discovered that there was no unknown primate DNA in it. I know of two samples that have apparently shown some kind of primate DNA. One is from the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky. The TV series Expedition Bigfoot took a soil sample from a tree structure in the Appalachian Mountains, and this came back as having DNA from the genus, the family Pan. Which is the family the chimps belong to. I'm unclear from what's on the internet whether this was chimp DNA or something related to a chimp. Helpfully, that episode is not available if you in the UK. So this is something I'll need to try and brush up on a wee bit myself. And there's another one from Bhutan, which apparently had some form of unknown primate DNA. But again, there's not a lot on the internet about that. But this is an area of research that's got a lot of potential. Just to say, obviously, traditionally a species would need a tight specimen, but I think if we got some DNA, like a good enough DNA sample from widely separated locations, this could potentially be a big pointer to say that there's a creature out there. So the various hair samples as well, but again, without a type specimen, you can't conclusively say where they're from. There's a type of hair that's often discovered in North America that is believed to be a Bigfoot hair, which, and again, there's some unusual features that have been discovered in hair samples in widely separated locations, but without the actual type specimen, you can't really say this is definitively Bigfoot hair. So where does this leave us then? So we've got a large body of reasonably consistent eyewitness testimony for times, places and cultures that are sort of far removed from each other. I mean, contrary to the this kind of sceptical cliche that the plural anecdote isn't data, we have a large number of we've got a large body of eyewitness testimony reporting similar things that at least maybe gives us a phenomenon that sort of requires some kind of explanation. So reports coming from all continents, wildly different environments. We've got the mountains of the Himalayas, the Australian outback, and even the sort of farmlands and plantation woods of Scotland. So, but I mean, the commonality really seems to be they're coming from places where people are. So, I mean, I know that's not necessarily saying that much because humans are pretty much everywhere in all kinds of environments, but that does seem to be the common denominator. So, yeah, so it suggests that that's maybe a person-centred phenomenon rather than purely zoological one. So, there's I mentioned earlier, there's an element of hoax in, but I think given the diversity of reports from time, place, and culture, that this can only account for a proportion of it. It can't account for the phenomenon as a whole. So, and again, misidentifications play a part. It's worth noting that a lot of the area across Eurasia, from the sort of Caucasus across Asia into North America, this area has bears, and they're often reported to as being they're often sort of looked to as being a sort of go-to explanation of for what people are seeing. And I think possibly plays a part, but a lot of the reports, the creatures described doing things that clearly a bear couldn't do, but also there's instances where people get a really good look at the creature. The other thing when trying to write off a lot of these explanations is try to write off these encounters as misidentified wild animals or known animals. That you compare that the Australian Yowie is basically as a phenomenon that's almost identical to Bigfoot, but their indigenous wildlife is completely different. So they don't have bears, but the Yowie is essentially identical to Bigfoot, how it's reported, how it acts, how it looks. So, for instance, they're never described having tails, they don't hop. So a lot of them don't really just sound like misidentified kangaroos. So that's kind of interesting that we do have like almost like a control sample. We could say, well, the wildlife's completely different here, but the phenomenon is essentially the same. So, but it's not to say that obviously there aren't a percentage. It could be certainly all Bigfoot sightings or whatever that are bears, but again, can't account for the whole phenomenon. So I've not really delved into this, but a lot of these. A lot of sightings of hairy creatures are linked to other sort of unusual phenomena, often linked with strange lights, sort of poltergeist phenomena. I mean, Bigfoot is alleged to like knock on trees. They're often alleged to chuck stones, strange cries. So it's basically the same phenomenon. Knock on the side of buildings. Just people from remote hunting cabins reported that creatures will come up, bang the walls, and so on. And that's these basically all phenomena that occurred in a city would be accounted as a poltergeist. So there's this element of sort of high strangeness where they're linked with strange other strange phenomenon. The author Joshua Cutchin termed the term wildnisgeist could be almost like Bigfoot's almost like a backwoods poltergeist. I would recommend, if you're interested in this, I'd really recommend the book he wrote with Timothy Renner called Where the Footprints End. There's 2 volumes of it, which is a really in-depth look at the high strangeness phenomenon with Bigfoot. So again, it suggests that maybe dealing with something that isn't purely biological. So the last thing I could say is that as our kind of understanding of human evolution improves, it's kind of coming clearer for a good chunk of our existence we weren't alone, and we coexisted with other higher primates, which are both human and non-human, some of which have contributed to our DNA. So perhaps this phenomenon represents some kind of desire not to be alone, for some of our cousins still to be out there. So could there be something in the backs of our brains that could be induced somehow, whether it's some of the external triggers that maybe being in the wilderness for long enough could maybe trigger this sort of strange phenomenon that leads us to see these creatures. So thanks for listening. If you're interested, a written version of this talk will appear in the next issue of Zine, Wolverstein, which will be out sometime in the autumn. So that's the website address, and you can follow the updates from the zine on that Instagram. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Scott. A very interesting and informative talk. Lots of places for us to put on our travel list when everything is fully opened again. I'd love to be able to go and look for some of these things, but I'm not a multimillionaire, so can't afford to, unfortunately. But if anyone out there has some money that they'd care to send towards the Edinburgh Fortean Society, I'm sure we'd be more than happy to organise some expeditions. So thank you again, Scott. And of course, thank you to everyone who's given talks in all of these series of events that we've had. And thank you all for coming and watching them, because if nobody was watching them, there wouldn't be any point in doing them. So thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe.